On June 8, 2025, reports emerged that President Donald Trump had ordered the deployment of 2,000 National Guard troops to Los Angeles in response to protests sparked by large-scale immigration raids conducted by Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE. The protests, which escalated into clashes between demonstrators and federal agents, marked a significant moment in the ongoing tension between federal immigration policies and local sanctuary city policies in Los Angeles, a city with a substantial immigrant population. This deployment, authorized under Title 10 of the U.S. Code, was described by the Trump administration as a necessary measure to address lawlessness and protect federal personnel. However, California officials, including Governor Gavin Newsom and Los Angeles Mayor Karen Bass, condemned the move as purposefully inflammatory, arguing it was designed to provoke rather than resolve tensions. This analysis explores the events leading to the deployment, the dynamics of the protests, the legal and political ramifications, and the broader implications for immigration policy and federal-state relations in the United States. By examining the available sources and critically assessing the narratives presented, this report aims to provide a balanced and thorough understanding of the situation, background, immigration policy and tensions in Los Angeles. Trump's immigration agenda. Since taking office in January 2025 for his second term, President Donald Trump has prioritized a hardline immigration policy, fulfilling campaign promises to initiate the largest-scale deportation operation in the country's history. The administration set an ambitious goal for ICE to arrest at least 3,000 migrants per day, a target that has led to widespread raids across the United States, including in Los Angeles. These operations have not only targeted undocumented immigrants but have also inadvertently detained individuals with legal status, including permanent residents, sparking legal challenges and public outcry. Los Angeles, the second-largest city in the U.S. with a significant Hispanic and foreign-born population, has been a focal point for these enforcement actions. The city's status as a sanctuary city, where local law enforcement limits cooperation with federal immigration authorities, has created a flashpoint for conflict between the Trump administration and local leaders. The administration's rhetoric, led by figures like White House Deputy Chief of Staff Stephen Miller and border czar Tom Homan, has framed these protests as a violent insurrection against federal authority, further escalating tensions. The spark, ICE raids in Los Angeles. The protests began on June 6, 2025, following a series of ICE raids across Los Angeles County, targeting workplaces such as the Fashion District, a clothing factory, a warehouse, and a Home Depot parking lot in the Westlake District. At least 44 individuals were arrested on June 6 for alleged immigration violations, with some reports indicating up to 118 arrests over the week. These raids were part of a broader strategy to ramp up deportations, with ICE officers executing search warrants at multiple locations. The operations were met with immediate resistance from local communities, particularly in predominantly Latino areas like Paramount and Compton. Protesters gathered outside federal detention centers, chanting slogans such as "Free Them All" and "ICE Out of LA," while holding signs demanding full rights for all immigrants and "Stop the Deportations." The demonstrations escalated as protesters blocked intersections, freeway off-ramps, and federal buildings, leading to confrontations with law enforcement. Escalation on June 7. By June 7, the protests had intensified, spreading to the Paramount area, approximately 20 miles south of downtown Los Angeles. Demonstrators, some waving Mexican flags, clashed with federal agents in riot gear, who deployed tear gas, flashbang grenades, and pepper balls to disperse crowds. Reports describe chaotic scenes, with protesters throwing rocks, bottles, and fireworks at authorities, setting a car and a dumpster on fire, and vandalizing Border Patrol vehicles. The Department of Homeland Security, DHS, claimed that over 1,000 rioters surrounded a federal building, assaulted ICE officers, slashed tires, and defaced property, though these figures could not be independently verified by some outlets. Local law enforcement, including the Los Angeles Police Department, LAPD, and Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, faced criticism from federal officials for their response. ICE Acting Director Todd Lyons accused the LAPD of a delayed response, taking 55 minutes to assist federal agents due to traffic congestion and chemical irritants deployed by federal forces. The LAPD, however, defended its actions, noting that it had declared an unlawful assembly and issued dispersal orders, detaining multiple individuals who failed to comply. The National Guard deployment. Trump's directive. On the evening of June 7, 2025, President Trump signed a presidential memorandum authorizing the deployment of 2,000 California National Guard troops to Los Angeles under Title 10 authority, which allows the president to federalize the National Guard in cases of rebellion or danger of rebellion against federal authority. The White House justified the deployment as a response to address the lawlessness that has been allowed to fester, citing violent mobs attacking ICE officers and federal property. The White House justified the deployment as a response to address the lawlessness that has been allowed to fester, citing violent mobs attacking ICE officers and federal property. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt emphasized that the move was necessary because California's feckless Democrat leaders have completely abdicated their responsibility to protect their citizens. The memorandum specified that the deployment would last for 60 days or as determined by Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, who was also authorized to employ additional regular armed forces if needed. Hegseth escalated the rhetoric, posting on X that the National Guard was being mobilized immediately, and warning that active-duty Marines at Camp Pendleton were on high alert for potential deployment if violence continued. This threat raised legal concerns, as the Posse Comitatus Act generally prohibits federal troops from engaging in civilian law enforcement without explicit authorization. Timing and context. The deployment order came as Trump attended a UFC event in Newark, New Jersey, alongside high-profile figures like Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Mike Tyson, and Joe Rogan. This juxtaposition of a high-profile social event with a significant domestic escalation drew criticism from some quarters, who saw it as indicative of a performative approach to governance. On Truth Social, Trump praised the National Guard for a job well done late on June 7, despite reports indicating that troops had not yet arrived in Los Angeles by early June 8. A federal official later clarified that the Guard would arrive within 24 hours. Federal versus local authority. The decision to federalize the California National Guard bypassed Governor Gavin Newsom, who typically holds authority over the state's Guard units. Newsom condemned the move as unprecedented and purposefully inflammatory, arguing that there was no unmet need for additional law enforcement and that the deployment was designed to create a spectacle. He urged protesters to remain peaceful, warning, "Don't give them a spectacle. Never use violence. Speak out peacefully." Los Angeles Mayor Karen Bass echoed these sentiments, stating that the city had not been informed of the raids in advance and that the National Guard had not been deployed within city limits as of early June 8. Reactions and criticisms. Local and state officials. California's Democratic leadership was unified in its condemnation of the National Guard deployment. Governor Newsom described it as deranged behavior, particularly criticizing Hegseth's threat to deploy Marines as a violation of norms against using active-duty military for domestic law enforcement. Mayor Bass called the ICE raids mass chaos, accusing federal agents of sowing terror by chasing people down the street. She emphasized that Los Angeles, a proud city of immigrants, was coordinating with immigrant rights organizations to respond. Other California Democrats, including Senators Adam Schiff and Alex Padilla, and Representative Gil Cisneros, also criticized the deployment. Schiff called it unprecedented and designed to inflame tensions, while Padilla accused the federal government of sowing more chaos and division. Cisneros highlighted the irony of Trump deploying the National Guard for protests but refusing to do so during the January 6, 2021, Capitol riot. Congresswoman Sarah Jacobs described the move as an unnecessary escalation that risked militarizing communities and eroding public trust. Immigrant rights advocates. Immigrant rights organizations, such as the Coalition for Humane Immigrant Rights, CHRLA, and the American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU, of Southern California, condemned both the ICE raids and the National Guard deployment. CHRLA's executive director, Angelica Salas, described the raids as targeting street vendors and day workers, and noted that lawyers had been denied access to detainees, calling it very worrying. The ACLU urged elected officials to halt what it called an oppressive and vile paramilitary operation. Chris Cepeda-Millan, a UCLA professor studying immigrant movements, noted that Los Angeles has historically been a center for immigrant rights activism, making the protests a predictable response to aggressive federal enforcement. Federal officials and supporters of the Trump administration and its allies framed the protests as a direct challenge to federal authority. White House Deputy Chief of Staff Stephen Miller labeled the demonstrations an insurrection against the laws and sovereignty of the United States, while Vice President J.D. Vance called protesters insurrectionists, carrying foreign flags and attacking immigration enforcement officers. Border Czar Tom Homan, who was in Los Angeles to oversee ICE operations, declared a zero-tolerance policy for violence or property damage, stating, "We're making Los Angeles safer. Mayor Bays should be thanking us." U.S. Attorney Bill Escalate, the interim attorney for the Central District of California, warned that anyone obstructing federal agents would face arrest and prosecution. FBI Deputy Director Dan Bongino also issued a stern warning on X, stating, "You bring chaos, and we'll bring handcuffs. Law and order will prevail." Posts on X from Trump supporters, such as at Rhonda T79756055, praised the deployment, expressing relief that the administration was taking a hard stance against leftist riots. Public sentiment on X. Posts on X reflected polarized sentiments. Some users, like at Hercules_ing, described Los Angeles as a war zone due to violent leftist protests, amplifying the administration's narrative. Others, such as at El Zerchet, criticized Trump's actions as risking a civil war and questioned the constitutionality of the deployment. At Librasic challenged media outlets for framing the events as protests rather than illegal alien riots, reflecting a segment of public opinion aligned with the administration's rhetoric. These posts, while not conclusive evidence, highlight the divisive nature of the issue and the role of social media in shaping public discourse, legal and political implications. Legal authority and the Posse Comitatus Act. The deployment of the National Guard under Title 10 authority, which places the troops under federal control, has raised significant legal questions. Typically, National Guard units are under state control unless federalized for specific purposes, such as responding to a rebellion or natural disaster. Trump's use of Title 10 cites incidents of violence and disorder as constituting a form of rebellion, a justification that has drawn scrutiny. The threat to deploy active duty Marines from Camp Pendleton has further complicated the legal debate. The Posse Comitatus Act of 1878 prohibits the use of federal military forces for domestic law enforcement unless expressly authorized by Congress or the Constitution. The Brennan Center for Justice noted that such a deployment would require invoking the Insurrection Act of 1807, which was not mentioned in the administration's statements. The last time the National Guard was federalized in Los Angeles was in 1992 during the Rodney King riots, but that deployment was at the request of then-Governor Pete Wilson, unlike the current situation where Newsom opposed the move. Civil rights attorney Robert Patillo called Trump's bypassing of the governor unprecedented in recent history, arguing that it sets a dangerous precedent for federal overreach. The Los Angeles Times also highlighted legal concerns, noting that the deployment could erode public trust and raise the potential for violence. Federal-state tensions. The deployment underscores a broader conflict between the Trump administration and Democratic-run states like California. The administration has criticized sanctuary policies in Los Angeles and other cities, accusing local leaders of harboring illegal criminals. Trump's memo also hinted at potential cuts to federal funding for California, a move that could further strain relations. Governor Newsom's accusation that the deployment was a political spectacle reflects a long-standing tension between California's progressive policies and the federal government's immigration enforcement priorities. The state's significant immigrant population. Census data suggests a large portion of Los Angeles is Hispanic and foreign-born, makes it a symbolic battleground for these. Political ramifications. The deployment has significant political implications, particularly in the context of Trump's second term. His administration's aggressive immigration policies are a cornerstone of his political brand, appealing to supporters who view the protests as evidence of lawlessness enabled by Democratic policies. However, the move risks alienating moderate voters and galvanizing opposition in Democratic strongholds like California, where resistance to federal immigration enforcement is deeply rooted. The rhetoric from administration officials, such as Miller's use of insurrection and Vance's condemnation of insurrectionists, suggests an attempt to frame the protests as a national security threat, potentially justifying further escalations. Critics argue this language inflames tensions and risks escalating peaceful protests into violent confrontations. Societal and community impact on immigrant communities. The ICE raids and subsequent protests have had a profound impact on Los Angeles's immigrant communities. Mayor Bass and Governor Newsom's wife, Jennifer Siebel Newsom, emphasized that the raids instill fear in communities where immigrants are essential to the life and heart of our state. The detention of individuals like David Huerta, president of SAU California, for allegedly obstructing federal agents, has further heightened concerns about targeting community leaders. The sweeps have also disrupted local economies, particularly in industries like fashion and construction that rely heavily on immigrant labor. The ACLU reported that children were among those detained, raising humanitarian concerns about family separations. Immigrant rights advocates argue that the raids undermine trust in institutions and deter immigrants from accessing essential services out of fear of deportation. Escalation of protests. The deployment of the National Guard risks escalating protests further. A senior law enforcement source warned that the move could backfire and only provoke additional agitators, citing the presence of dozens of potentially violent demonstrators. On June 7, organizers have already called for a third day of protests on June 8, suggesting that resistance is likely to continue. The use of tear gas, flashbangs, and pepper balls by federal agents has drawn comparisons to heavy-handed policing tactics, further fueling anger among protesters. Videos showing officers pinning protesters to the ground and deploying chemical irritants have circulated widely, amplifying calls for resistance. Broader national implications. The Los Angeles protests are part of a broader wave of resistance to Trump's immigration policies, with similar demonstrations reported in New York and Chicago. This suggests the potential for nationwide unrest as the administration continues its deportation campaign. The economic cost of mass deportations, estimated at over $1.4 trillion, has also sparked debate about the feasibility and consequences of such policies. The deployment of the National Guard in a major urban center like Los Angeles could set a precedent for similar actions in other cities, raising concerns about the militarization of domestic policy enforcement. Critics warn that this approach erodes democratic norms and risks escalating tensions into broader civil unrest. Critical analysis of the narrative. The sources provided, while extensive, present a mix of perspectives that require critical scrutiny. The Trump administration's characterization of the protests as violent mobs and an insurrection relies heavily on DHS claims of 1,000 rioters attacking federal agents, but outlets like Reuters noted that these figures could not be independently verified. This raises questions about the accuracy of the administration's narrative and whether it is exaggerating the scale of the violence to justify the National Guard deployment. Local officials, including Newsom and Bass, argue that the protests, while disruptive, were largely a response to aggressive federal tactics, such as ICE agents chasing people down the street. The lack of advance notice to local authorities about the raid suggests a deliberate strategy to bypass local cooperation, potentially escalating tensions. The polarized language on X, from war zone to civil war, reflects how social media amplifies extreme narratives, often without verifiable evidence. These posts, while useful for gauging public sentiment, should not be taken as factual accounts. Similarly, the administration's use of terms like rebellion and insurrection may be a strategic choice to invoke legal authorities like Title X or the Insurrection Act, but it risks inflaming public sentiment and misrepresenting the nature of the protests. Conclusion. The deployment of 2,000 National Guard troops to Los Angeles on June 8, 2025, following 2 days of immigration protests, represents a significant escalation in the Trump administration's immigration enforcement strategy. The move, justified as a response to lawlessness and violent mobs, has been met with fierce opposition from California officials, who view it as a provocative overreach designed to create a spectacle. The protests, rooted in resistance to large-scale